Welcome back. Welcome to Decision Space, the only show that takes place right here, in the space between the turns in your favorite games. I'm Brendan Hansen.
I'm Jake Friedman.
And this is the podcast about decisions and games.
And today we're talking about action point systems. The reason we want to talk about this topic is because we've recently undergone a deep dive into Mexica. We've also talked about Tikal a lot on this show as well. And those are two premier examples of an action point system in games where you have a menu of options and you get to decide how you want to spend a variable number of action points on your turn. So on this show, we're going to explore that topic, discuss what the benefits are, what the drawbacks are to this type of mechanism, what its strengths and weaknesses might be another better way of putting that, and also talk about some of the games that use it, and when not might this be something you want to add into your games.
Awesome. Okay, this is just classic what we talk about. So we're going to have a meandering, lovely conversation about action points. We're going to try to define it and then dive in. Jake, so we could cover a lot of topics in what we talk about like this, and we have. But I think we both have been eager to have this conversation, in part because you and I both really enjoy action point system games. And on its its largest level, I'm going to try to define it, and then we can play this semantic dance game where we're like, this counts, this doesn't count. I think this is a thing, this is not a thing. But we won't do that for the whole episode. But there was a great conversation in our Preplanners channel on our Discord all about this topic, sort of trying to say, what are action point games? Should they actually be called action menu games? What counts? What doesn't count? So we want to sort of distill the best of that conversation and serve it up to you so you can glean insights. And if you ever want to participate in conversations like that leading up to our episodes in the future, you can join those conversations in our Discord, and there's a link to that in our show notes. We're always talking about episodes coming up.
While we are not the arbiters of what is and is not an action point game, there are many folks who are, and they all exist on our Discord.
Especially in our Discord.
Yeah. So that would be the place to go and there's nothing wrong with that if that's something that you're really interested in, kind of pulling apart differences in mechanisms. There are a lot of folks that are very eager to talk to you about that topic there.
And I am interested in the topic in so much as I think that I'm fine with really broad definitions typically, right? But there have to be some parameters so something counts. So I wanted to start with this the most broad possible definition, and then we can work backwards from there. So you have a pool of action points, so two or more. One thing, getting to do one thing is not enough because the combination of what you do with your actions matters. And then you spend those pool of actions, so at least two, on different options. So at least two different options that you're presented with. So the simplest form would be like, you have two actions and you have a choice of doing these two things, and maybe the order matters. And I bet that wouldn't quite feel like an action point game, but at its most basic level, that's the idea. You have a pool of actions. Say you have 10 actions on your turn. Here's a menu of things that you can do with them, and maybe some of them have different costs. And there's this whole spectrum and range of in between, right? Where some games, maybe you have 4 actions on your turn, and then there's 6 options. Or maybe like in Tikal, you have 10 points and there's 7 options, and they all have different costs.
Yeah, I really like that definition. I think it's a good way to cut through some of the noise with an action point system game like auctions. If you really wanted to go broad, this is a case where you could make the argument that essentially everything is an action point system game, but that doesn't really get us anywhere, because essentially actions are what options are available to you in the game, and action points could be kind of defined as anything that limits your access to being able to do everything that's available to you in the game. But I like your definition of kind of pulling that back a little bit and saying you have to have discrete options and you have to have at least 2, because yes, doing a game where it says like you're doing one thing on your turn and there are different options what you can do, maybe like an Emotep, that is not really an action point system because you just have one, right? So that is, I think, missing an incredibly important and meaningful part of this. which is exploring like the combination and interaction between these different things you can do within one turn. So I like at least guarding our conversation off from the do one thing games.
Yeah. Yeah, like a worker placement game where you have a whole bunch of options of worker placement spots. On your turn, you're going to place one worker. That's not an action point
Yeah.
game, right?
And I think even if you were to place multiple action workers or do multiple actions, let's take a Raiders of the North Sea, for instance. There you have a really great mechanism that we've discussed on the show before where you get to place a worker, do an action, pick up a different worker, and do an action. I think some people would consider this like a form of action point system because you have a bunch of different options on your turn and you're doing, have limited ability, right? You essentially have 2 action points to spend with an additional sort of form of mechanical artifice of the workers that you're placing and picking up. However, for me, I think that would be outside the bounds of this conversation, but I'm curious, Brendan, if how that strikes you.
Yeah, I'm struggling with that one in part because I think the part of the fun and the magic of action point systems, right, is the combination of these things. I have 10 things to spend. How can I mix and match these 10 options, these 10 actions to do something meaningful in this single turn?
Hmm.
And you get just a hint of that in Raiders of the North Sea, but to me, it's about the sequencing and this really, really massive decision tree that comes from these games, right? If I have 10 actions and there's 10 options to spend those actions on, the search and the possibility space of that game and that game's decision tree is massive in a way that when you cut that to be a lot smaller, where there's say it's maybe even 2 points, 2 workers, and 7 options or 8 options, it's just a much smaller space and the games feel meaningfully different. um, Again, I'm not here to say yes or no necessarily. I'm just
Yeah.
here to say the more options, more action points is probably going to feel more like an action point system game, if you want to call it that, than something that trends in the other direction.
Yeah, and where I'm going with this too is this question of mechanical artifice, right? What when there are things that get in your way, the game is throwing at you that makes it difficult to access certain options on a given turn. Whether that's
Mm,
worker placement game where even if you can use a bunch of different workers on one turn, perhaps options will be blocked by other people's workers. Or a game like the Castles of Burgundy, right? This has a pretty cool, has a lot in common with an action point system game. You have 2 actions that you can do on each turn, and you have 4 possible things. You can take a tile, place a tile, sell a good, or get more workers. However, when I've played Castles of Burgundy, and before starting to think about this topic, I never considered that an action point system game because the dice have such a uh, important role in determining what you are able to do, and like so much of my brain power when I'm playing that game is more about like how can I utilize the random input the game has given me. Uh, to make the best of that more so than just exploring the combination of the possible actions available to me. So for that reason, I think, games that are really using dice or random card drop in our Discord, people brought up a game like Dominion as like this is a game where you have 5 action points that you could spend in the form of cards. And like I think, you know, to me that's getting more into the territory of everything is an action point game. So I think for the purpose of this conversation, I would like to exclude also all of these games which have action, a certain number of actions you're doing on your turn, but there's like some other mechanism that's like getting in the way. Here I want
mm.
just like here's a menu of things you can do and a certain number of times you can access it.
So for you, Jake, the having that menu at the outset of the game is pretty key, right? This like shared into Tikal when you're teaching Tikal. This is probably that action point system game. It's not the first one I played, but the one that most I think I even still think of as like this is like the prototypical example. And I bet there were action point system games before this. There are many after. But when you're teaching the game, you pass out the little player aids that says, okay, y'all, here's everything you can do. We can, place one of your workers on a tent. You can move one of your workers, and this is what you need to do to be able to do that. You can open a new temple. You can, do all of these different things. Dig for treasure, exchange treasure, go on and on and on through this menu, and each of those have a cost. I think that being given a menu like that at the beginning is a big sort of flag that, okay, this is probably an action point system game or an action menu game, if we're going to call them that.
Yep, I totally agree. And I think the distinction here is in Tikal, you're not always able to do every single one of the things on that menu, but it's not because of some input on the front end. It's on sort of the back end of kind of like what's going on the table that would make something possible or more common. It's not possible or impossible. It's like optimal or not.
Yeah.
Right? You could in the first round of a game of Tikal move a worker and then claim that temple at one point so that nobody could take it, but you would never do that. However, the fact that like that's available to you right off the go, that to me is a key indicator of like now we're really in that action point territory.
Okay, so now that I've said we're not going to just have semantic conversation about what we're even talking about the whole
You should have
episode,
never said that.
I should have never said it because I want to ask you. I put in the notes a pandemic as an example.
Yeah.
Pandemic to me feels like a hyper simplified cooperative action point system game. So you have 4 points on your turn and 8-ish options of things that you can do, but they're broken into a couple categories, right? So in that game, Jake, you can move your pawn, and there's a few different ways you can do that. You can just move directly adjacent for an action, but then you can also use the card system in that game to fly anywhere on the map and these different things, or move between CDCs that your team has put down. You can build more of those CDCs or research stations. You can treat disease, you can trade cards, and you can discover a cure. It's a really limited set, but to me, it still feels like an action point game because the order that I do things and why I'm doing them matters. And thinking about that sequencing is a big part, but not the only part of why action point system games are compelling, I think.
100%. I think for me, Pandemic is a quintessential example of an action point system in games.
Okay.
However, you should know, Brendan, that is probably the minority opinion on our Discord. I was really surprised to see how much people felt like that wasn't the case. And I think a lot of it stems from this idea that, well, you might have 8 possible options available based on the game. However, there's probably only one thing that's actually viable to do on your turn, or way less than that. To me, that doesn't actually change the mechanics like on the page or in the rule book.
Yeah.
You know, as you develop mastery in Tikal, right, you probably start whittling down
Yeah.
more and more what's viable for you to do. Things that you once considered as a variety of options in your 10th game, in your 100th game, you might have learned that really only one of these things is what you should be doing right now. And so I don't really subscribe to that opinion that as you become better at a game, that changes kind of how the mechanics show up.
Yeah, I definitely agree with you. And just because Pandemic is slightly simpler in terms of action points, because you have 4 players or multiple players solving the puzzle of that game on a given turn, potentially even on your turn, right? You might have players telling you what they think you should be doing, and ultimately, if it's your turn, you're the decider. But just because it's simple enough that you can usually see the best thing to do doesn't mean in Tikal or Mexica or Cusco or Torres or any of the other games we might discuss that there isn't a best thing to do, assuming some certain outcome. So I agree with you.
Cool.
Jake, do you have other examples you want to kind of put out there as standout examples of what we're talking about? Or do you want to just at this point move into talking about this type of game? What makes them compelling? What does it feel like to play these types of games? Maybe lessons that we've learned playing these games from a design perspective or changes that we've seen?
Yeah, so I want to bring up a couple of other games, and I think that Pandemic is a great segue to that because one of the places you see this mechanism show up a lot is in cooperative games in general. Um, that's an area we have not ventured into as often or as much in this podcast. But I think Pandemic is one example of that. One that I'm really familiar with as well is Arkham Horror, the Living Card Game. That's another game that gives you, very similar to these other ones, a player aid that can tell you, like, here's the options you can do on your turn, and you can spend action points to do it. Things like draw a card from your deck as an action point, or gain a resource. You'll put equipment into play, and some of them cost actions to go into play. Others are quick actions that you could do for free. And then sometimes you'll use actions on your turn to activate things that are on the board or equipment that you've already put into play as well. So that's another case of cooperative game, but a much more complex one. And that might feel like you have a more rich menu of options. And a lot of that game comes down to sequencing your turn, what order you're going to play cards in, and move around the map as well, to be as efficient as you can in fighting against whatever scenario you're up against. And then in a similar vein, Mansions of Madness is another game I have that also uses an action point system where you'll be moving around the board, interacting with the board icons, using your actions to fight monsters, and actually complete puzzles that will pop up on the digital thing that you're using to, like, host the map as part of that game. So I think there's a piece of this mechanism that lends itself really well to these kind of like cooperative adventuring games. So I think there's something to that, but I think we need to mention these here as well when we're discussing this mechanism.
Do you think that part of that, Jake, just to stay on the co-op thread for a minute here, since we're there, and we probably won't come back to it, knowing you and I, do you think that part of the reason why this has become trendy within the co-op space, or at least was really trendy, is one, probably in part a lot of emulation of Pandemic, which was this sort of touchstone game in co-op space that did that and sort of showed that this is a good framework that works. You have games like Burgle Bros that come after and kind of take that simplified, hyper simplified action point system thing, and run with it. Or even Matt Leacock's Forbidden Island, another game that kind of uses the same system, that becomes in vogue for cooperative games, in part because there are so many options. Every turn is a puzzle to solve, and it creates the opportunity for having a conversation about that puzzle as you sort of unpick all of these different options together. And if you present, through an action point system, it gives players maybe more options than you could otherwise have with these sort of tools that affect the game state in some way. So instead of sort of having a cooperative game that's a decision between, say, we have option A and option B, that's decide between these two outcomes in a way that maybe works really well for something a little bit more simple, like Castles of Burgundy. And I'm oversimplifying here, versus, wow, we could do A, then B, then C, or A, B, C. And it allows people to bring a unique perspective, which then fuels conversation at the table. So you get a play pattern that, as a co-op designer, you want to see, which is your players are talking to each other about the game while they're playing it.
I think it's a little bit column one, a little bit column two, which is that there's something about an action point system in cooperative game that really brings out, and this is going to be a throwback decision space term here, but the agential or decisional theme of the game, right? In
Ooh.
Pandemic, and by that, what I mean is, like, how thematic are the actual decisions that you're making? Like, when you're making decisions in the game, do you feel like you are doing the thing that the game is saying that you're doing through the text and cardboard in front of you? And in Pandemic, right, you play as the CDC racing around the world trying to combat the outbreak of a pandemic, a global pandemic. So when your actions are, charter a flight, right, set up a quarantine, and all these other ones as well, discover a cure, share knowledge, right? When you're deciding to do that, it's, I think, a lot easier for players to overlay that, a big menu of
Mm.
actions that sound like something that a CDC person might actually do during this kind of time of emergency, onto what they know about life, right? Where you have in real life, all kinds of options at your disposal, and your limiting factor, more often than not, is time. I guess time and money, but that's kind of abstracted out in these games, right? And so I think when you have a big menu of things, and it's like you can only do some of these things on your turn, that feels a lot like what it is like in real life to make decisions about how to accomplish a big goal, a big task, something like that. So I think it works really well there for sort of bringing people into the theme, especially in these cooperative games. Talking about pandemic, but the same is true of Mansions of Madness, right? When you're like kind of an adventurer running around a spooky house, choosing when to run away, when to fight, when to investigate a mysterious ruin that you found in the basement.
In terms of this, the way it plays out on the table, Mexico to me doesn't feel sort of hyper thematic, Jake. While I'm playing it, right, I don't feel like I'm building the city of Mexico, but the way that Mexico sort of comes to be on the table, this is so silly. It feels plausibly like if you had a time lapse of Mexico being built or something, it feels like it would look like that, which is probably not true at all. But the city feels real. It feels organic. It feels like it didn't just come into shape on accident, I guess is what I'm saying.
Sure.
And I haven't always played city building games that feel like you're making a thing that's quote unquote real, even though that's not even really what you're doing in Mexico. That's such a ineffective way of trying to communicate what I'm trying to communicate. But I think that a, a hallmark of these games is that you are given a lot of agency as a player, a lot of options, a lot of sort of power, right? The agency to make different choices and a lot of options to consider, and that gives you a certain feel that empowers you and can also lead to you feeling creative in your decision making in a way that simpler games don't always offer.
Nice. I think you're making it much harder on yourself by talking about Mexico than if you had mentioned Tikal, which to me feels like a much more immediately thematic game where you're essentially running an archaeology field school, and you're sending out archaeologists across the jungle, discovering, or sorry, I should say, like rediscovering ruins, kind of digging them up, trying to claim the most prized real estate to set up base camp. I think as you see those little archaeologists go out across the board, that to me feels like it has a much stronger form of that kind of agential theme where
Mm.
I'm like, if I'm overseeing this like archaeology project, like how am I going to spend my resource? Am I going to be trying to collect, uh, you know, the pottery shards? Am I going to be, trying to go to a bunch of small sites, or build up one big site? I guess dig out makes more sense. But I say that maybe partly because my wife is an archaeologist, and the first time she played Tikal, she was like, "This is just like running an archaeology school."
That's so funny. I feel like in some ways, no, I completely agree with you. And I think that we've identified this thread, right? That maybe it's Tikal or maybe Pandemic or maybe Mansions of Madness, certainly Burgle Bros. This framework of action point systems and menus you can bolt on thematic hooks fairly easily because you could write down where are all the things that someone who's trying to solve a global pandemic would be doing and just make those options within the game.
Right.
So I think that that's how you end up with a lot of these action point system games that feel somewhat thematic because they have these strong footholds for evocative sort of language to be printed physically on the game that then makes it feel thematic, even if maybe in practice it isn't totally. But then the opposite end of the spectrum are games like Torres, which Torres is another
Right.
Kramer and Kiesling action point system game that's not about anything. It's an abstract
No.
game, and it tries to be about castles and knights, and
No.
it's just about putting sort of pawns on a board and moving them around, trying to get them high up as you build this play space out with little platforms that you can add that increase the size. And that's not thematic at all. It also is a fairly interesting example of an action point system game because It comes out shortly after Tikal in late 1999, I guess. I think it's that same year, Jake. And Tikal has 10 action points and 7 options, and Torres already cuts it to 5. Says, okay, 10's a lot of combinations. This sort of giving players that many options in terms of even just the actions you can use leads to a lot of potential analysis paralysis, which will discuss more. So they cut it in half. If you just have 5 things to combine into 6 options, maybe it will go faster. Is sort of the thinking there, I think. And that's an interesting design trend, but it's really 5 action points to spend on 6 options with a bunch of cards that just balloon the decision space back up in
Yeah.
an interesting way. It's sort of a dynamic menu in Torres because one of your actions is always playing a card that is a card from a deck of 15 cards that all represent unique actions. So Torres introduces this idea that action point systems don't always have to have the same actions being used.
Yeah. Yeah. Totally interesting. I think where my head is stuck on, Brendan, is I think what we
Yeah.
stumbled across that might be really obvious to folks uh, listening in at home, but feels interesting and insightful to me is just this idea that like with action selection games, you can print on the action on the board, which you just said, that
Yeah.
makes it more thematic feeling versus, if you have a worker placement game and you put a worker on an action that says fight, like you're so far removed intellectually from fight because your brain
Mm.
is thinking about the worker and the different actions available to play it. Where if we cut out that middleman and you just say, I want to fight in Mansions of
Mm.
Madness or whatever, like my action is fight,
Mm-hmm.
it brings you there so much easier. Like it's just way
Mm.
easier, I think, to get into kind of any sense of like theater of the mind, any sense of like agential theming when you're just like the literal action is what it says instead of the literal action being like placing a tile that then causes conflict, like in a Tigris and Euphrates, and people will argue to the end of the world and back about Tigris and Euphrates being like actually very thematic. But I think a lot of people play that game and don't get that sense at all, like me. And I think because so much of where the actual brain space is counting tiles, trying to like figure out where the correct placement of a tile is, that will then cause a revolt as opposed to just being like revolt.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. That in some ways, what you're saying, if I'm reading right, Drake, a worker placement game adds it makes the act of you taking and selecting an action even less abstract because typically thematically you're sending your worker to a place to do a thing that makes sense at that place. You go in Keyflower to the carnival to get more workers, right?
Right.
But in pandemic, you might not always have a place to go when you're discovering a cure. And it's just the idea itself of I now have the pieces of discovering a cure. I'm not moving anywhere. I've discovered it. Look, I'm discovering the cure. So you
Yeah.
can take these more abstract actions that aren't physically as represented on the board within that space, and that feels more thematic in a way. Because it's not
Yeah.
always the same type of thing. That's interesting. Yeah.
I think, yeah. And less, I think less so like that you'd have to like move somewhere, but more just like that, like the literal action is just this, right?
I
As in
am doing this
there's
versus
no
my
step,
worker.
there's no extra
Yeah.
step to get there. Yeah.
Yeah. Interesting.
Exactly.
Okay. Yeah.
All
I'm
right.
doing this, not my worker. Cool.
Okay. So let's talk about the decision space
Yeah.
created by these kind of mechanisms. You ready for that?
Yeah. I'm so ready because these are bar none, I think, some of the largest, that doesn't mean best, right? The largest decision spaces that we've discussed on the show,
Yeah.
just because of the combinatorics of if you have all these actions and all these options, all of a sudden the decision tree just balloons to be pretty massive. So, what does that mean? It means that at first, these games can be a little bit tricky to learn. You just have to learn everything that you can do in the game. And then you have to think about the order in which you might want to do those things and how they relate and associate. And then on any given turn, you have to think about all the branches of that really big tree and think what would be best. So it means that heuristics start to get pretty important in this type of game. And that means by heuristics, right? Shortcuts to understand what you should be doing to try to prune through all of those the trees on that decision tree to get to, okay, it's early in the game into Tikal. I probably want to do this because I know doing this at this stage in the game is generally good.
Yeah. I'll push back a little bit. I think that these games are not necessarily. I think you said there can be challenging to learn. I actually think that point games can be like easier to learn because you just
Mm,
have to learn the actions and how they work,
yeah.
and then any of the complexity that comes from that is kind of like emergent on the board versus uh, a different type of game, like a worker placement game, where it's like taking a turn's easy. Just place a worker. Now I'm going to explain the 26 spots you could put a worker and like
Yeah.
what they do. So I think actually learning is often really easy. Maybe that's another secret to kind of the success of pandemic and
Mm.
why this kind of like ushered in was a big part, I think, in ushering in sort of a golden age or rebirth of board games. Um, but I think what you mean is that these can be difficult to play. Like,
I mean, that's definitely true too. Yeah.
right, like once we get into the game, it's like now that I have all these actions available to me, what on earth should I be doing? What on earth should I be prioritizing? That can be really, really difficult, especially in a game like the Master Trilogy games where you have a huge amount of things and you don't just have to decide one thing, you have to decide a combination of different things to do on that first turn. So I think that is where the analysis paralysis can really enter here, is that sort of getting over the hump of starting to understand like why you would want to do certain things. I think once you get there, these games can be just fine. But the kind of the learning curve is where Tikal, I think, shows its age and kind of shows that this is from a different era in board gaming, when people would be playing their games that they purchased many, many times. I know a lot of people still do that, but that was more so the expectation than now, where the design principles often tend to prioritize a really awesome first play experience. Tikal probably isn't as interested or concerned in giving you that. It's more concerned in giving you like a really great 10th play experience.
Yeah, definitely. And I think all of these games do that pretty well. Um, Pandemic is definitely trying to do the really good first play experience,
Totally.
right? Through simplifying, it's trying to get to the point where it's like you're making meaningful decisions, you're doing interesting things as quickly as possible. And I think you see that through the simplification, but you lose somewhat, is some of the depth in the decision space because you've given up some of that complexity. Jake, let's pull back. I feel like I want to just pull back. Why do you like these games a lot? You like action point system games, right? Why do you
Yeah.
like them?
I think I like high search in games. That's something that I enjoy, right? That's something that tickles my brain when I get to look at a bunch of different options and try and figure out the best thing to do. And these games tend to provide that robustly.
Yeah.
On every turn in T-Call, you will have a fun puzzle to unpick, um, which is saying something. I think a lot of games, a lot of modern games definitely offer you really interesting, really intriguing things to figure out. But then you might have a few turns in between of like just pressing a button or two to like get to that decision point. Tikal is kind of hitting you over the head with it. So I enjoy that high search aspect. And I think the other aspect that kind of goes hand in hand with that is a little bit more ability for personal player expression, than with some other mechanisms. T-Call really gives you that agency, right? To say like, I'm going to play really aggressive and kind of like try and take over somebody's temple right away versus like, I'm going to try and like turtle and put kind of passive pressure to like, I'm going to put plenty of people here so that hopefully people just stay away. And different play styles can be successful, and different people playing these games will manifest differently on the board. I think that's really interesting. And I just want to say too, that's not just in Tikal. I think that's also absolutely true in games like Arkham Horror and Mansa Madness, of like how aggressive are people going to be, how cautious are they going to be, what are they going to like prioritize uh, in the scenario. I think there too, you kind of have the opportunity for player expression, and then player expression then brings us back to that like agential theme, right? Where it's if I'm expressing myself in this game, that's another thing that like brings me back to like, oh, I feel like I'm actually like thematically making decisions that fit with like what's happening in the game.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I don't love high search games typically, right? Like you really enjoy those type of games. I will put up with them if I think the game is worth the squeeze. But in the case of action point system games, I I like it here. And I think part of that is because there's for me this aesthetic joy of just combining things is fun. So whether it's playing Duplos with my 3-year-old and we're combining these different pieces and it's fun seeing how they fit together, or cooking and combining different ingredients and seeing what comes out, or playing an action point system game and looking at in my head just thinking, right, from turn to turn, how do I want to chain together these actions? There's some joy in sort of taking these disparate pieces, in this case of a turn, different actions I can take and combining them into some thing that's more. And what I mean by that is, right, like Jake, when you play Tikal or when you play Mexica, on your turn, there's this bigger, you're asking yourself a couple things. You're asking yourself, what are the specific actions I need to take to accomplish something good? That's the mechanical question you're typically asking. But then more broadly, because of the way these menus work, oftentimes you're asking, what do I need to accomplish this turn? Right? And that's what you were just hinting at with Tikal. Do I want to add infrastructure to the board by putting more tens out? Do I want to try to secure points by paying one of the two times I can pay to this big lump sum to just say this temple is mine now and it's mine for the rest of the game. But I'm forfeiting having this person ever again, and I spent half a turn to do that? Or do I want to position myself for a future turn, right? And you have that in Mexico too. Is this a turn where I'm trying to add a new district to the board, or is this a turn where I'm trying to position myself for future turns? Or is it a turn where I'm taking a downbeat and giving up my actions now to get them on a future turn, but doing that bank to action thing that we've talked about how you can do? And I think that that question of what do I want to accomplish is for me a huge part of the fun, because you have to think through that high level. Okay, strategically, what am I accomplishing this turn? And then you do the second level. It's not just okay, I need brick, I'm going to put my worker on the brick spot and then I get bricks, so in a future turn I can do this. It's I need to set myself up so I can have a really explosive turn next turn, because I know after that turn it's going to be the last round in the game. So how do I best accomplish by mixing and matching these auctions, positioning myself for an explosive turn next turn, whatever that means?
I think you've done a really good job of kind of defining high search and some of the things to think about there. I want to press you a little bit on the point, um, because when we're talking about high search, right, we're talking about games that give you a big combinatoric decision space, right? Well, that could be one of the things that leads to a really high search game. But I think that perhaps the search in an action point game feels different than the search in a game like A Feast for Odin or
Mm,
Five Tribes, because here in an action point game, this might not be the right term for this, but I almost want to call it like an intrinsic high search. Like your options are always the same, and how you're going to kind of combine them is what you're searching through,
yep.
more so than like an extrinsic one, which is like it's kind of coming from outside the internal main mechanism of the game of like what I'm doing on my turn. And instead now I'm like I'm literally scanning and searching a giant board for the best move in Five Tribes and trying to like it almost feels like more of like uh a kind of hidden like what's the term for like if you're like looking at a picture and trying to find like the hidden stuff. It's almost feels more like that than uh in Tikal or one of these Master Trilogy games or an Arkham Horror, where it's like, no, I know exactly what I can do, It's all right here. I just have to figure out the best sequence to do it in.
Yeah, when you said that, what came to mind for me, Jake, is the difference between, in some ways, A Feast for Odin to me kind of feels like being presented with, and this is an example of a game that's not an action point system game, being presented with 90 doors, pick the best door to go through. Whereas an action point system game, sometimes it feels like being given the prompt, get to Albuquerque. And then you, right? Like, okay. So I could walk, I could fly, I could bike, I could do all these different things. And that feels really different than just being presented with all these doors. And ultimately, right, you're doing the
Here's
same things.
7 doors. You can go in and out of them each 3
Sure.
times. Choose
Yeah.
the best sequence.
Yeah. And in both of these frameworks, right, you're trying to find the most optimal decision, but it
Right.
feels different for those
Yeah.
reasons. Yeah. I don't know.
There might be something there, I think, about kind of this high search manifesting differently and, appealing or not to different people in different ways. And I think,
Yeah.
we're all omni gamers. On this podcast, certainly the host, I think most of the listeners, I think most people are, right? Where even if it's a game mechanism you typically don't like, you can find an exception to it. So I think
Yeah.
it's worth kind of like digging in. Like you say, oh, I typically don't like high search games, but I find myself really drawn to these. I think there's something there to why it's a little bit different here in an action point system game than it might be in a different type of high search
Yeah.
experience.
Now we have to talk about the other type of AP because we've talked about action points a lot, but we haven't talked about analysis paralysis a lot, which, right, your analysis paralysis being that some players, while playing games, when presented with many options to consider, like a high search game, for example, that can be paralyzing. It's difficult to decide between all these options. So sometimes what you get with a game like Tikal or any of these action point system games is players taking a long time to decide what to do. There's so many things to consider. And that's one of the things that's brought up as sort of the chief reason why I think these games don't get made as much. And I've experienced that at the table, Jake. They're
Yeah.
one of the inherent problems of these types of games. It is very true that if you are willing to spend 10 minutes of everyone's time to find the best solution in T-Call, sometimes you can find a better move.
Yeah.
And that makes for a more fragile magic circle, right? If two of us are on the understanding that we have 2.5 hours to play this game, which would be plenty of time for T-Call, it should be, that we all need to, on average, have our turns be a certain length. And two of those players are sort of like, I'm going to make sure I'm making the best possible move on my turn. All of a sudden, the balance of, are we like the fairness of how that game feels at the table, the social dynamics just kind of warp and the game almost breaks down, right? So how do you square that, right? Like we can see the design trend.
Yeah.
This okay, we're going to give less options, fewer actions, fewer
Right.
options,
Micro
simplify.
turns. That's
Micro turns,
Paul
yeah.
Solomon, host of this show. He loves that. He thinks that is a fantastic innovation in gaming, right? Where, we should be moving even, I'm putting words in his mouth, but moving even more towards that, right? Just quick, snappy turns around the table, distill our decisions down to the core element, the core fun element of it and have at it. And I think those games are fine too. And I can't disagree with you. I think there are definitely a lot of people out there that find games with a lot of options more AP inducing than others. However, I'll put forward a different perspective that is almost that this is a strength of these games. Um, a strength because, as I already mentioned, right, each turn feels like really fun and satisfying, which is not something you always get in a micro turn game like Emotep, where you come away from the game at the end being like, that was really cool. I had a good time. But
Did I
like
do anything?
on any individual turn, it's like, that was nice. That was nice. That was nice.
Yeah.
Versus this where you have to wait a little bit longer on the table, but then when it's your turn, you're like really rubbing your hands together, get to like dig in on some fun stuff. I'll also say that all games can be AP inducing to different folks, right? Where
Yeah.
this, and I don't want to like straw man this argument. Certainly, a game that has 10 action points and 7 actions that all cost different things is going to be more AP inducing to more folks than some of these other games. But there are some people that would find that less AP inducing than a game that's just asking them to make like one really hard choice, right? Where where things seem really equal. My wife can kind of be like that sometimes, where it'd be like a really simple game that has like limited options could almost be like more AP inducing because she
Yeah.
wants to make the right one
Yep.
versus a more complex game that gives you more options. That's like a little bit easier for her to say, okay, this seems like good enough. I'm
It,
happy with this.
the game gives you the cover of not
Right.
missing the obvious. Yeah, Jenga comes to mind as a game where, there's not that many options on a turn of Jenga towards the later, third of the game, but you might have someone take 5 minutes, kind of
Right.
carefully try to decide it. I've seen that happen. That's a great point. Okay, Jake, I want to, and since you're not strawmanning my argument, I want to take the perspective you just added and say, let's play a thought experiment. What
Okay.
if what if Mexica, which we just covered, so I'm going to keep going back to it. I also like Mexica a lot as an action point system game. What if you just had one action per turn, but it's the exact same game, and you, as one of your actions, could say pass and bank extra actions up to 3. Um, what happens to that game? What do you lose about that game, but what do you gain? And we won't know, right? Because we're not playing, but just your top level, sort of what are your instinctual responses to that? Which pushes it more towards the micro turns that you're saying.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, I think that's the biggest difference, right? Is the game probably, ideally goes around the table a lot quicker. Um, I think that's a clear change, a strength to some, weakness to some. But I think you lose kind of the ability to feel clever. You
Yeah.
lose the ability to make big swingy moves.
Yeah.
Something we talked about being uh, something, some of our favorite decisions in games, period, on the last episode. I think Mexica as a one action game does not feel like it has big swingy thematic moves in the same way it does as a 6 action point game where you can have the potential to bank and use many more actions than that in a single turn.
Yeah. Yeah, that's a great point. And for me, that's sort of what I was hoping you would say. And it's interesting you brought up Tigris and Euphrates as an example. That's a game where you do two things on your turn. You have a hand of tiles, you play 2 tiles.
Some would call it an action point system.
Some might, I sure wouldn't. But I also think of games like Blue Lagoon, another Knizia game in which you're playing and you just play a tile to the board, right? Where you make these really incremental actions on a given turn towards your ultimate goal of what you're trying to do. And I think those games succeed because they're trying to do something different. But if you take a game where you have, Tikal and Mexica, Cusco, you have pretty broad objectives of what you're trying to accomplish in general. You're given this like generic problem to solve of get a lot of points. Here's how you will get points in the system of creating point opportunities in a shared space. And then you have to fight over those opportunities with everyone else. Like that's what the Mass Trilogy does. Here, you exist in this shared space, make opportunities to score, and then make sure you're the one who gets to score them. That's how these games work. I think if you do those two incrementally, like you said, Jake, you never really feel like you accomplish much on your turn. So you don't feel creative because you're not doing something in a clever way. Everyone can see what you're doing because if you take one move, you're signaling what you're going to do next. And I think that you also probably don't get the benefit of that uncertainty, right? You doing 10 action points worth of things on your turn into call means that it's really hard for me to guess what you're going to do on your turn. Whereas if you just did one, kind of like in Blue Lagoon, I quickly get a sense for what you're trying to do. And then the decision becomes, do I stop Jake from doing it or do
Right.
I just let Jake do it? And that's a really different type of decision.
I think it forces you into like more ambiguous and safe lines too from like an
Yeah.
actual like strategic perspective, which takes away a lot of that player expression also, right?
Yeah.
Where uh it's through the big moves and doing a lot of things at once that like somebody tells you kind of who they are through their play in the game. Where I think Mexica is an example of a game where it has that now. If we shrunk it down to a single thing, right, then it's everybody just kind of doing the same kind of little game of chicken incremental things all over the board. And
Yeah.
it would force, I think, more kind of like assimilation in play style, which is probably not where you want to be.
Yeah.
Can we talk really quickly before we wrap up this episode, Brendan, about kind of game design considerations for this mechanism.
Yeah, absolutely. Do you
Cool.
want to beyond the most basic consideration? How many
Okay.
actions do you have? That's not how many actions do you have? How many things can you do with them? Or what can you do with them? What are your agencies? How much can you do those agencies? That's the most basic baseline, right?
Right. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I think those are definitely important things to consider. And I think kind of why would you want to have a system like this in your game is probably to try and like get players close to the decisions that they're actually making, to give players that opportunity to express themselves and be creative problem solvers in the game.
Mhm.
However, I think this is a really, really difficult uh, type of mechanism to design with because it gives players so much agency that what's happening on the back end of the game is going to be like felt really profoundly by players, right? If that makes
Mhm.
sense. Like if anything is not calibrated just right in the other part of the game, right? Whatever players are acting upon, uh, you're going to feel that in the play because players are just going have the ability and agency to just hammer the same button over and over again, right? Whatever is giving them points, whatever is, kind of working that system is always going to be available to them. So I think it really takes a lot to create a game that is rich, kind of changing, malleable enough to have an action point system in a game where it does feel like it's changing, where it does feel like over the course of the game you have a lot of different considerations, and it's not just obvious, to the criticism with
Mm.
pandemic about what action should be taken by players.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I think that part of that too, right, is okay, you have the pool of actions, the pool of options. It's also sort of within those pools, how many different types of things can you do versus how chunked are the options, right? So, like in Pandemic, there's sort of two chunks. There's movement options, which there's a few, and then there's other stuff, which is usually tied to disease curing, but not always. There's actually a fair amount of options. In Tikal, there's a few things. They all relate to people being on the board and moving those people. So adding people, moving people, that's one option. Then you have temples, which is sort of this build shared puzzle. And then you have treasure. So that gives you these two broad things. And then there's the campsites, which add the network
That's
building.
people movement, yeah.
That's people movement. So you have those chunks. I think once you get too far away from these broad chunks, things get kind of complicated.
Mhm.
In Mexico, you have move your person or build out the board. And those are, or I guess add, and then also maybe add dominance to the board through your own
Yeah.
temples. So it's really those three, or bank actions for a future turn. I
That
think that
almost doesn't even count. That's
it
almost just
almost doesn't
like,
count,
yeah.
but it is something you could do. Um, I think that that's something to consider is sort of if you could have actions and options and provide a fair amount of options, but have those options chunked so that there's different versions, that probably makes the games more approachable, replayable, so that I can think as I'm making those decisions, it becomes the sort of like metro system, right? Of, okay, do I want to move this turn? Yes. Okay, I'm going down this path. Here's what I can do with movement. No. Okay, I'm going down this path. That means I either want to do this or this, right? I want to if it's a city building game, I want to gain more property. Do I want to do that for speculate on the future of the value of that property, or do I want to spend on the property that I have now? Maybe the city won't be built around what I think, so there's tension there between will this be worth what I think it is at the end of the game, you know? And then there's different ways to do those things within it. That to me feels like an interesting way to sort of tease out and map
Yeah.
out the player experience and the design itself.
Yeah, you need to have some kind of, or need is a strong word. It's nice, I think, in these games that works well to have like some sort of like output randomness, right? Where you don't know what's gonna happen once the board gets back to you. That's where the
Mm,
tension is in Mexica and Tikal too, right? Where it's like, I really want to go get this treasure now, but that's gonna leave the door open for somebody to come in and, you know, put a dominant force on my temple and take it over. It's like I hope that doesn't happen. Um, Like that's what makes those turns so thrilling and fun. So I think that's an important part of the recipe is like what is changing between turns that's going to keep these actions fresh, kind of to rephrase what you're saying.
A lot of the examples we put out there, Jake, use boards. You mentioned games that don't feel like action point system games to us, that don't use boards, that are really other genres, right? Like Dominion has literally has action points within the game, but it doesn't feel like an action point system game for all the reasons we already laid out. But do you think you could make a game that feels like an action point system game without a board that has a shared space? And would that be interesting in the same way?
Without a board that has a shared space,
Yeah.
I think you I think it's doable. I think it's a really, really interesting design prompt for somebody to take. Um, I just think you'd have to be, it would again, it would still require some kind of, I think, uh, random output, right, based on what you're doing. Maybe instead of having dice rolled first that uh, dictate or cards drawn from a deck that dictate what actions you have available on your turn. It would be something that comes after that, you know, then kind of determines what's changed, what's going to be interesting the next time your turn comes around. It's probably a lot more of a kind of a less interactive affair, but I think you could definitely do it with cards. In fact, the Arkham Horror Living card game is kind of like that. It's a cooperative game. You do have a shared space built out from cards, but could you find a way to do it without that? I think that you could, and
Would it
have
be
it be
fun
more of like
though? That's the caveat that
the
I didn't
question
say out
that
loud.
like, do you need a shared board to have fun action selection or a fun action point system game? I don't know. I think it's doable. I'm thinking of
Yeah,
like a game like Eon's End, right, where you have just kind of like a boss that sits at the top of the board that just does like generally bad stuff to players, and
yeah,
you're kind of cooperatively fighting it through your own tableau of cards.
yeah.
But uh, instead of kind of the way resources work in that game, it's more of like an action selection thing. Now I'm thinking of like what is the mechanism in Eon's End? Is it this?
Hmm.
But I think it's more of like a traditional kind of like deck builder thing. But yeah, I think it's totally doable. But maybe it's not to your preferences as like
Yeah.
more.
I think one of the things that it does accomplish is that when you have a lot of action points that you're spending on actions, there does become this sort of onus on the game to this like accounting problem, right? Can that player do what they say they're doing? Like if it's a tableau building game where I'm just taking 10 actions on my own tableau and that's just affecting my stuff, can I
Yeah,
trust, right?
right.
Come becomes a really big problem. Whereas with Tikal, I've never played it where people aren't narrating their turn. I move this person here, spending 3 action points. Then I do this and that's 2, and then I do this and that's 2.
If you
And
have to, so that people like check your math.
yeah, and then invariably someone gets to the point where like, and then I do this and oh, okay. What am I at again? I'm at 8,
Yeah,
I do think that
totally.
it solves that problem that at
Yep.
least a little bit exists, which is interesting. I hope there's an interesting takeaway there at least. There's something about the mixing of matching of pieces too that's not the abstracting using a board. If you lose the board abstracting, I think it's harder to combine things in your head in that same way almost. I don't know. At least for me, I'm a pretty spatial thinker.
Yeah, interesting. Maybe people can share an example with us of a game that does kind of fit into this prompt, um, if any exists. And the last thought I had with design consideration for this is just, if you're working on designing a game, I think that like an action point system is a great starting point, right? Like figuring out like what do I want people to be able to do in this game, like, I think that's like a good way to kind of like get kick started with whatever your idea is. And when you get to a point where, hey, this is, why is this not as fun as I want it to be, or why does it not feel like quite as like challenging or creative? I think that is very possible and fine, and perhaps that's like a good opportunity. Then you can think about ways to add a little bit of mechanical artifice of saying, like, okay, well, what do I want to add into this game to make it a little bit more challenging for people to do what they want, or make it a little bit more interesting, a little more, whether that's like additional like costs, maybe different resources come into the game at that point, maybe dice rolling, or a deck of cards, something that's providing some kind of input randomness. I think that could be a successful way to kind of like get a design off the ground.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I giggled only in part because you saying that, Jake, made me think back to when I was designing Enchanted Plumes, one of my own card games, where you do one or two things on your turn, and you can either start a new plume or add to a plume. On its most basic level, these are
Wait,
knobs that I was having. No, it is not an action point
this
system.
is
It
totally an
is not.
action
No,
point
it
game
is
that
not.
fits your prompt exactly.
It is not. It is
How is
not.
it not? Wait, scroll back up to the top of the doc. What was your definition again? 2+ actions that you can spend on 2+ options.
Oh no.
Brent, would you say that is true of your game, Enchanted Plumes?
I think if we're forcing it into a box, then yes. But I don't. It does give. I will
Are
say.
you saying Enchanted Plumes is not fun? Then I'm so confused.
No, it's very fun. I think that it does. It's interesting. It does give you some of the creativity. It doesn't
That's
feel like an action
hilarious.
point
That's
system
so
game to me,
funny.
but yeah. But those were knobs I was thinking about, right? Like, how many cards should you play on a turn? How many cards should you have to play on a turn? What should you be able to do with your cards? That's how we sort of got to. You could make more than one plume, right? So what you're saying, I do think that this is a really sort of it lays bare some of the sort of mechanisms undergirding games and forces you to think about them in a clear way, which is why you can take this framework and Frankenstein it onto any game you want if you really would like to do that, of sort of saying Dominion has this system, yeah, I
Yeah,
guess, right?
yeah.
And you can
Magic the
take this
Gathering.
system,
It's
yeah,
just variable action points based on how much land you
how much
have
mana you
available.
have, yeah,
Yeah,
exactly, yeah, I have 5 action points on my turn, that, yeah, great. But that's interesting, right? Because it is a way of thinking about what how is the game giving me an ability to do things, and what am I going to do with that ability? What are the options? And I think that that's a really good framework, like you're saying, Jake, to start a design from. How much agency do I want a player to have on a turn? How many choices do I want them to have
and
with
what
that
do I want
agency?
them to be able to do?
Do exactly. Are they pursuing one goal, multiple goals, etc.? Okay. Wow, that was like classic what we talk about, Jake. We
Yeah,
made it through the
there are
darkness.
probably some insights that we hope you as a listener gleaned from there. Maybe it wasn't any good ideas that we had, but perhaps some idea we had kicked off an actual good idea for
Yeah.
you. And hey, we would take that as a big win.
At least as much clarity in this episode as there is in a decision space of an action point system game with more than 5 actions, which
Heck
is a
yeah.
joke only for our own listeners at this point, I feel like. So we're just really down the rabbit hole. But thank you so much for listening. We want to, for all of our pre-planners, those are the folks who want to play games along with us to prepare for future episodes. We're going to have deepish dives coming up of Age of Innovation is going to have at least maybe sort of the Haggis style treatment, well, where Jake and Pete are going to talk about sequel games and then use Age of Innovation as a sequel, it following upon Terra Mystica, which got a sequel in Gaia Project, which got a sequel in Age of Innovation. And then also at a later date, again, Pete and Paul are going to talk about Fromage, a new game that Pete and Paul are really excited about. That's also available to play on BGA as it's in Age of Innovation. So if you want to prep for those episodes, you can do that on Board Game Arena if you don't have the options to do so physically.
Awesome. Well, thank you all so much for listening to this episode. We should, as always, thank Hembry for our intro and outro song, Reach Out. We should thank our patrons and everybody in our Discord for helping us to prep for this episode. Thanks so much for listening and have a great week.
Bye, y'all.